Today we're talking about the sign of Sagittarius, that wonderful, exciting, optimistic sign that happens right at the end of the year, right up to the time of Christmas. And each year, Sagittarius happens approximately between November 22nd and December 22nd. Some books say the 21st, some books say the 23rd. It varies depending on how the Earth's axis is shifting. But it still happens at the end of the year, and it's what we call a fire sign. And fire is one of the four elements of the zodiac that are, like in nature, very important to look at, because fire and air mix together and earth and water mix together. And Sagittarius is part of the group that we call fire. And what also happens with the zodiac is it alternates between masculine, feminine, or conscious, unconscious. So what happens is what we see when we come to Sagittarius, as with all the fire signs, and since fire is a rather aggressive but also rather assertive element, we oftentimes attribute that to the more masculine. And it doesn't mean that if you're a woman and you're a Sagittarian that you're masculine. It would suggest that there would be more of an intuitive ability to operate from your inner instincts and take handles and take hold of what you're doing, and go for it. And that's very definitely what Sagittarius has a tendency to do. It doesn't really think about what would happen if it was to walk off the cliff. They're the ones that you can call on a Friday afternoon at about 4 o'clock and say, hey, would you like to go to Southern California for the weekend? And they'll be packed in 2 minutes. They probably already have a backpack packed in their closet to go someplace, because these people are not the types that let moss grow under their feet. They like to go. If they don't have a car or some form of vehicle, they feel paralyzed. So it's very important that they at least have a bicycle. Usually they have a car, sometimes 2 or 3, to not only meet their traveling needs, but to meet the moods that they have when they go traveling. Sometimes they like to travel elegantly, so they might have the Mercedes. Sometimes they like to travel, just kick back, go into the mountains, so they'll have their Jeep or their 4-wheel drive. Sometimes they just want to scoot around town and they'll have their little sports car. And so this is one of the reasons you see them being very fond of things like different kinds of cars, trucks, pickups, mopeds, motorcycles. And they're kind of fun because whatever your mood is, they'll adjust to you. And this is part of what the beauty of this sign is about too, because it's also what we call a mutable sign. Now there's 3 different ways of operating in the zodiac, and there's 3 different groups. First of all, let's talk about the other 2, and then we'll talk about this group. There's the cardinal group. The cardinal group are the ones that include Aries and Libra and Cancer and Capricorn. And the cardinal types are the ones that'll just kick the door down and pioneer something new and get a business going, maybe not thinking how they're going to finish it, but they get it going. Then there's the next group, which is the fixed group. And the fixed group is Taurus and Scorpio and Aquarius and Leo. And they're the ones that finished what the first group didn't. They're the ones that you can really depend on. They're real stubborn. I mean, they have a mind of their own and they'll nod their head and do exactly what they want, but that's the way they are. Now, in order to blend these 2 groups, you've got to have a third group, and Sagittarius comes under the category of the third group, and the third group is the mutable group. I always call mutable in my classes the movable group, because this is an easier way to remember it. And the mutable group includes not only Sagittarius, but its opposite sign, Gemini. It also includes Pisces and Virgo. And these 4 groupings, or people who have a lot of this in their chart, any of these, are what we consider to be rather flexible types, people that are going to kind of connect people with other people, and they're not going to be on a position too stiffly if it makes sense to kind of move around things. So they're much more flexible. And the other thing, too, about Sagittarius, each sign of the zodiac has its little caption. For example, Aries is I am. And they're really into who they are. Well, the caption that describes Sagittarius is the caption, I believe. In other words, I have vision. They're the ones that are always quite lucky. I mean, even if they're down to their last dollar, literally, they'll always come up with another one. And there'll always be people there to help them, and there'll be people there to support them in their ventures. And they'll tell everybody about their ventures, too, because one thing about them is they're not very closed-mouthed. The thing about Sagittarians, I don't know, and this is probably not very fair, but it's in my experience, I don't know if they're the ones you really want to tell a secret to, because they may not be able, it's not because they don't want to keep the secrets, it's just that they want to just tell everybody everything, and whatever is on the mind just comes right out of the mouth, even if it's something that's not so comfortable or not so positive. For example, if you have a very, very dear friend, say, for example, a Sagittarian friend of yours who you dearly love hasn't seen you for a long time, and in the course of that last 6 months or in this last year, perhaps you haven't seen them and you've put on some weight and it really is bothering you. Suddenly you see your Sagittarius friend and they look at you and they hug you warmly and they're so happy to see you and they say, gee, you've put on a lot of weight this last year, and that's the least or last thing you wanted to hear. And they didn't say it maliciously, it's just they see it, it's on their mind, and they say it. And so for that reason, they're considered to be a rather blunt group of people. Sometimes they can be kind of tactless too. One of the characters I'm reminded, actually not a character, he was a real person who was a fabulous speaker, but he was a very pointed speaker and a very pointed writer who was a Sagittarian, was Mark Twain. And Mark Twain had that wonderful sense of humor, which is always associated with this sign. That's a very Sagittarian quality, and there's something very charming about it. And I think being a fire sign, and since fire has a lot to do with purification, that we really need that energy, because if we don't have fire in the zodiac, the other two fire signs of the zodiac are Aries and Leo. If we don't have fire, we can't purify things. Fire can be devastating, but it can also purify and cleanse. The Native Americans are associated with Sagittarius because the sign or the symbol for Sagittarius in astrological shorthand is simply an arrow. They worked a lot with fire. That was an element that was very much a part of their ritual. In fact, ritual is also very much a part of Sagittarius. Sagittarius is associated with the 9th house of the zodiac. The natural zodiac has, of course, 12 houses, 12 signs. And the 9th house is always associated with such things as the higher mind. Now, I'm not giving any disparaging remarks for poor Geminis, who are the opposite sign of Sagittarius, because Gemini is always associated with the lower mind, and Sagittarius is always associated with the higher mind. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean one is better than the other? No, that doesn't mean that. Gemini is considered the 3rd house, or the house of the lower mind, because the energy of Gemini is to gather information and disperse it. In other words, process information. That's really a very key factor in that sign. When we move across the zodiac to the opposite field, into the 9th house of the zodiac, that's the house of the higher mind, and that's the house that's associated with Sagittarius. Higher mind means once you've processed all this information, now how do we use it? How do we put it together? How do we synthesize it? How do we take this piece over here on the right and put it together with this piece on the left and come together with this bigger vision in the middle? And so that's why we see this sign being associated with visionary thinkers, people who can literally, even in their dreams, actually literally in the dreams, see the building they want to build, or who will write books in their dreams. This is 9th house, where Sagittarius naturally falls, is the house of publishing. It's the house of publishing books. It's the house of advertising, marketing, knowing how to hook into the public pulse, which is one of the reasons they're very good, too, in the advertising and the marketing business. They have a real ability to just know what the public wants at that particular moment in time, and as a result of that, go for it in a marketing sort of way. Sagittarius is a group that whenever they travel, regardless of how well they're prepared, regardless of where they go, they're pretty lucky. They have people always helping them along the road. They meet all kinds of cronies and friends along the road, very much like the little boy on the tarot who's just joyfully walking along in life with the bundle that he needs on the back of him, and he doesn't even know it. And, they'll as they travel, just gather a huge assortment of friendships that they'll be in contact with over the years. They're the types that they can go out for 3 days on a journey without really thinking about where they're going or what they're doing, and come back with a new business venture because they were in the right place at the right time, meeting the right people. And foreign travel, or travel for them, is like food. In fact, sometimes Sagittarius would prefer traveling over food. These are the types who'll put the backpack on their back and walk into the deep mountains alone, without any help, and without any fears, and without any qualms, see God or see visions, and come back. Jesus was in the desert for 40 days and 40 nights. Jesus looks like a Sagittarian. Jesus had the Jesus Christ had the very long, skinny body, the long, skinny face. Sagittarius build, generally speaking, if especially if it's Sagittarius rising, which is when the constellation is there when you're born, and you have to determine that, of course, from the time that you're born. You could be a Taurus and be a Sagittarius rising. But when they're Sagittarius rising in particular, the body will have a long look to it. It'll have long, skinny hands, long legs, long, slender body, a long face, very much like an old lion that's kind of lost its meat, with a long hanging hair. And so for that reason, Jesus Christ is a perfect image. Another really wonderful image, if anybody remembers, it's a very famous old story, is Don Quixote. Don Quixote de la Mancha, who was what did he do? What did Don Quixote do? He was tilting at windmills. He was going out, and he had this incredible world of fantasy that he had built around him. And that's Sagittarius. And it was all very real to him. Dulcinea, who was really a tavern whore, became his wonderful maiden that he protected. I think it was Sancho Panza, which is his buddy that used to hang out with him. Used to be with him all the time, regardless of what was going on. He tilted windmills. He would have this old horse, Rocinante, I think was the name of the horse. And he was a skinny old horse and pretty ugly and probably pretty ready to die, but he was his wonderful white steed. And that's, Don Quixote is very much a character who is associated with Sagittarius. And I'm always remembering when I think of Don Quixote, the famous, I guess it's a sketch by Picasso, where there's this black charcoal drawing of this long, lean body with the flag on the horse. And it is interesting if you think about horses, because horses are also very much associated with Sagittarius. They're real good at horse races, and they love horses. Sometimes, actually, I've had many clients over the year that have been Sagittarians who have been fabulous horse trainers, who've traveled the world and been known for certain presentations with horses, or horse breeders. And the rough and ready cowboy, the cowboy of the West, is also very Sagittarian, with, riding the open range, not really having a place to call his home, which is one thing about Sagittarians. One of the things, if you're going to be involved with a Sagittarian, you better give them a very long leash, because they don't really like to be tied down unless, of course, there's some other aspects in the chart. But they need that long leash. And in fact, lovingly, but also truthfully, I always call them the married bachelors or the married bachelorettes. Even if they're married, they still have this feeling like they're single about them. It doesn't mean that they're unfaithful. It's just that they need a lot of freedom in relationship, because their mind has to stay free for them to still have life breath in them. But the horse, going back to the idea of the horse, there's a book, The Turquoise Horse, that I've been working on, and the horse is one of the most loved symbols or characters in all myths and stories. You always see horses somewhere. And the horse is considered to be an incredible animal, because it is probably one of the most intelligent and one of the most conscious animals of that size. It can be trained to do incredible things and be that size. The horse is considered to be the animal that carries the heroes or the heroines to heaven. Pegasus is a beautiful example of Sagittarian energy, the only white, beautiful horse with wings. And they carry the heroes to heaven in a very conscious way. There's a wonderful story, and I don't remember the book. I remember the cover was yellow, and I'm not very good about remembering names. I think it was a Native American stories or myths, and in it is the story of Sitting Bull. And they give Sitting Bull's Indian name something Tatanka. I know Tatanka is bull. And it talks about how when he was with the Wild West show, the horse was trained. His horse was trained when he would start to hear guns to dance, because that was part of the show. And what happened at the end of Sitting Bull's life, as there was a skirmish, apparently, according to the story that I remember, and there was a real shootout, I guess, and of course Sitting Bull was killed. But what was interesting, since his horse had been trained to dance when he heard gunshot, the horse was dancing as his master died, and it was almost as if he was carrying his master to heaven, which is a real symbolic story, I think. And then the horse stopped. He wasn't afraid of the gunfire at all. The horse is an animal that can carry people from one place in their life to another place in their life. And that's why Sagittarius is very much associated with the horse, because the energy of Sagittarius is about taking you out of one mindset and moving you through another mindset or to another mindset. And when the horse in the Native American culture became part of their culture, they were able to be very mobile at that point, and they became the people who wandered and roamed the plains. And this is why we very much see Native American energy associated with Sagittarius. And what's also appropriate too is that the turquoise, the stone turquoise, that is the color of Sagittarius, and the turquoise stone is associated again with the Native American religions and beliefs and cultures, as well as with many other Middle Eastern cultures who also have nomadic roots and origins. And the turquoise stone is considered to be a very strong healing stone. And Sagittarius is very much associated with healing, as is Pisces. And we will be talking about that when we talk about Chiron in the mythology section of this tape. The other thing about the horse that should be mentioned is that the horse is loyal usually to one master with which it has a spiritual affinity. Many times you hear of horses that'll only allow one master to ride them, and this is so true of Sagittarians. We say that they have a real free-wheeling side to them, but once they come together with someone who meets them on a very deep spiritual level, not only physical and emotional, but spiritual, they can be loyal for life. There's not even a question about it. That's just the way they are, because they really have the need to sit for long hours and discuss philosophy. I recall when I was in college a long time ago that we used to stay up till 3, 4, sometimes 5 o'clock in the morning, have a class at 7 or 8, and talk philosophy. We didn't talk about our lessons, and we didn't talk about anything that was really relevant in terms of getting our studies done and making it in the real world, but we would talk about God, and we would talk about philosophy and what makes the world tick, and why did God do this, and what's the purpose in our life? These are all questions that all of us ask. In fact, all of us have Sagittarius somewhere in our horoscope. It's not just that you have to be a Sagittarius to experience this. Each house of the horoscope has a different piece of our life that it represents. If, in fact, the Sagittarius part of you is in your house of goals, then it would suggest that your whole life is about helping people with their goals and meet their goals on a philosophic and spiritual level. So we can see this appearing in any part of our chart. It's also true, I've seen a lot of Sagittarians that have a very strong artistic quality about them too. I think it's because they're visionary types. Sagittarius and Pisces, both those signs of the zodiac, are ruled by the planet or the god Jupiter. In the old days, way before they had telescopes, before they could see the outer planets like Uranus and Neptune and Pluto, they only had 7 planets. Actually, they had the Earth, which is really the sun, and the moon, and 5 other planets, and Jupiter. And so what they had to do is they had to sort of double up signs of the zodiac and associate them with one planet. And Jupiter was associated with Pisces and Sagittarius. And we see artists, we see painters, sometimes sculptors, not so much sculptors as we see painters, especially people who do work like sacred art, religious art, iconography, people who work with ritualistic magic, or there's several people that I know that are doing like mask making now. There's several psychotherapists now that are doing mask making days and mask making therapy, where you do a creative thing like build a mask that would maybe be your alter ego, and you put it on your face, and then you design a play or a show around that, and then you just act out this entire character, and as you act out, you understand yourself better. That's very associated with Sagittarius and Pisces, and and we're also seeing more and more people working with Native American rituals to help understand their spirituality. Many, many, many years ago, in the middle to late 80s, several planets in the sky were in the sign of Sagittarius, planets that only appear there about once every 85 years, once every 165 years. These were very significant times. And it was around, of course, we had the wild and crazy 80s where everybody was spending a lot of money, which is also a side of Sagittarius. Oh, there's always going to be enough. Let's just charge it on the card one more time. That is a side of Sagittarius. But the other side, the other thing that came out of that period in history is that people started to, actually the Native American tribes began to slowly but surely, it's still pretty closed, allow some of their people to come out and teach the white people about their rituals and their magic. And so now, many years later, we see sweat lodges, we see drumming circles, we see people returning to the earth and having vision quests. The vision quest is very much associated with the sign of Sagittarius. where you go out into the wilderness with a knife, and that's about it, and maybe some water if you're lucky. Usually it's not even that. And where you are on your own for days and days and days and days. I would say the primal savage part that is in all of us, it's very much associated with the sign Sagittarius, because Sagittarius is associated with the ancient centaurs or satyrs, like the sign. When you look at the sign of Sagittarius, it's that half man, half beast. And let's talk about the race of centaurs. The centaurs were a pretty wild and crazy bunch of animal people, I guess. They were half men, women, and beast, usually horses or goats. And they wandered through the countryside having a wonderful time. They were very sexual. They were wild sexually. They ran and played. They weren't real responsible. And out of all of that entire group came one particular centaur, and his name was, in mythology, Chiron. And I guess what we can say is Chiron was more of a developed, more spiritually developed centaur. It would suggest that this maybe was the bridge. And in fact, it's very interesting because the asteroid Chiron was discovered around 1977, orbiting between the planets of Saturn and Uranus, and it's considered to be the Rainbow Bridge. And he was coming out of that race of centaurs, and he didn't really fit there, and he really wasn't a mortal. He wasn't really a man. He was sort of in between, kind of like, I guess, what it must be like to be a first-generation person whose parents might be born in foreign countries, and they're born here, and they're trying to fit in both worlds, and they don't really fit anywhere. And so what happened with Chiron is he came out of that race. He was more developed. He was more evolved. And the reason we say he's the bridge, he was probably the bridge between the bestiality, the very primal energy of the centaur, moving into the more mental and intellectual energy of mortals or more evolved characters in mythology. And the name Chiron is named after the Greek word for cheiria, which means hands, and it has a lot to do with healing and hands. And Chiron, in fact, was exactly that. He was a healer, and he was also one of the finest teachers in ancient Greece. And the reason he was such a fine teacher is he had this incredible gift. And I think the reason he had the gift was because he actually did come from intuitive beasts. So he had this basic prehistoric instinct in him. And he had this instinct in him about when the gods brought their children to him to be trained, he could see each one's special gift inside of them. And he would, as he tutored them through the years, he would slowly but surely bring that gift out of each student to make them become full as possible as a godchild. And for that reason, he trained everyone. In fact, he's given the credit of teaching Asclepius. Asclepius was the first physician in ancient Greece, and Chiron supposedly, of course, this is myth. We know it's not. Well, you don't really know, really. Sometimes you wonder. He was supposed to be the teacher for the first physician of Greece. And the way the story of Chiron goes, Chiron's not only called the Rainbow Bridge, but it's also called the Wounded Healer in mythology. And the reason it's called the Wounded Healer is that, and this is very applicable to Sagittarian energy, is that one day when he was out with one of his students, actually he was out with Hercules, Hercules got into the skirmish. Chiron really didn't have anything to do with it, but he was sort of like this innocent bystander. And what happened is the Hydra, which at that time was a poisonous snake dragon, some of her blood ended up on the tip of an arrow that ended up in Chiron's ankle. And if Chiron, in fact, had been immortal, he would have died. But he wasn't immortal. He was a god, or kind of in between being a god and something else. And so he didn't die, but he was deeply wounded. And for all the healing he was able to do for everyone else, for all his students, and to bring their special gifts out, he never was able to heal his own ankle. And so that's why we call him the Wounded Healer. And so Sagittarius is sometimes associated with wounded healing. In other words, as much as they can teach, as much as they can see the special gifts in other people, for all that they can see, there's a deep wounding inside of them that they can never heal. And that deep wounding, even though they can't heal it inside of themselves, is the impetus that's needed to allow them to be the catalyst for other people's consciousness and awareness. And if you watch Chiron, it's interesting. It was discovered in the summer of 77, in fact, when around that time in that following fall, holistic health started to come in. This is when we started to move away from the more traditional, I mean, we're still doing traditional medicine, there's no question about it, but where we started to see more of a holistic approach, in other words, mind, body, spirit approach, which is very appropriate for this particular symbol and this particular sign of the zodiac. So that was Chiron, and actually it's very interesting. Chiron actually does move around the sun. It has about a 50-year orbit, 49 to 50-year orbit, which would suggest that around the 49th or 50th year of people's lives, usually they have a wounding that occurs that is in a certain part of their chart that allows them to heal something that's been sort of a bugaboo their whole life. And after that, they many times become mentors. You'll see a lot of people becoming mentors, older men and older women, for people right after their 50th or 51st birthday. And in fact, this is exactly what Robert Bly, who's the men's consciousness movement leader, is talking about. He talks about how older men should be mentors for younger men. And it very much comes around the 55th year, and it's a natural progression of this cycle. Now, there's another character. Actually, probably I should have mentioned him first, but it was so natural to talk about Chiron, and I have a real affinity for Chiron. But there's probably the most important character in myth, and I really think he's a character. He's funny, but he's also outrageous, and that's probably a good adjective for Sagittarius, is outrageous, is the god Zeus or Jupiter. Jupiter was a pretty wild and crazy kind of guy, and in fact, I think it's appropriate at this point that we talk about how really lucky he was and how that is associated with Sagittarius because of the way he came about in his being. He was the son of the god Kronos or Saturn, and Kronos or Saturn is associated with Capricorn, which is going to be available on another tape. And it was predicted, or actually prophesied to Kronos, Saturn, who was a very responsible god and who built the civilization and liked his power. It was prophesied to him that one of his children would eventually overcome and overtake him and take over control of the sky, and I guess of the mythological kingdom. And in order to alleviate the problem, what Kronos proceeded to do, Saturn proceeded to do, is eat his children. And his wife, Rhea, begins to feed him these children, and she willingly does it. I never could quite understand that part of the story, but she did. And just as she came to the last child, what she did, she had a change of heart. And she then took a rock and she wrapped it in a blanket and fed it to Kronos, and he believed he had eaten all his children, and now the prophecy would not come true. In the meantime, the last child that was saved was Jupiter, lucky Jupiter, Zeus. And she takes him, the mother takes him to a cave far away where he's fed on milk and honey, which is very much the food that's associated with kings or the sign of Leo. And he grows up to be a pretty big god. In fact, if you look at the sky through a telescope, you'll see that the planets Saturn and Jupiter are the two largest planets in the solar system. And Jupiter, of course, is the largest. And he grows very large, and he finally comes back to his dad and he says, "Hey, Kronos, Saturn, you know the prophecy they said about one of your children taking over? Well, I'm back, and it's true." So they get into it because Saturn's not going to give up his position, and Jupiter feels that it's his right to take over. They spar, and they get into it with each other, and they fight, and they holler, and they scratch. And finally what happens after the tangle is his father, Saturn, says, "I give, you this is right, the prophecy was right, it's now your place to take over the kingdom." And so at this point, of course, Saturn steps down and Jupiter or Zeus takes over. Now, the symbolism in that story, which is very perfect, is that the father, Saturn Kronos, built the society. He built the buildings, and he brought order to the society. He brought the rules, the judgments. And he actually had built that society out of his father Uranus, or the god Chaos, which had no form. But now that the buildings were built and there was a kind of order to the society, it was kind of dry. And now what they needed was philosophy, and what they needed was beliefs and visions in order to move beyond the tangible. And so this is when Zeus, Jupiter, Sagittarius comes into play here, is that now we're moving into a society that has possibilities beyond the visuals, what we can see, that we can touch, smell, and feel. And so at this point now, Zeus, Jupiter is in control. And this is the planet that rules Sagittarius. Now, if anybody knows the story of Zeus, and every young school child has read at least one story in myth, they know that Jupiter was sort of a wild and crazy kind of guy. I mean, he was married to Hera, who was a power queen in her own right, but he also had many thousands of women consorts with whom he had children. And he was probably the most unfaithful of all the gods, but there's also reasoning behind the unfaithfulness. What would happen is every time he would have a child with a mortal woman, in that part of Greece where he would have that child, a sacred site was birthed. For example, Dionysus, where we had the Dionysian rites. And every place that he would have a child, there would be a sacred site, which is very much associated with religion and faith. We don't only have to have, when we have Sagittarius, metaphysical speakers or philosophers or great college teachers. We also have religious zealots associated with this sign. We have the Jimmy Swaggarts. We have the people that, the Billy Grahams, the people that get up there and talk about fire and brimstone and God and all of this. That's also associated with Sagittarius. And as these sacred sites were birthed throughout Greece, it was the birth of religion. And really the birth of something that was greater than the self, which was one of the major purposes of this sign of the zodiac and of the god Jupiter or Zeus. Now, the thing about him too, though, is that for all the children he had, he loved his children. And he was typically, and so perfect for Sagittarius, he was very indulgent of his children. He would let them get away with murder. He wouldn't be the world's greatest disciplinarian. And this too sometimes comes up for Sagittarian people. They love kids. They themselves are big kids. And it's sometimes kind of hard for them to set limits with their children, to say, no, there's a certain point you get to. Because we're not talking about Saturn, who was the judge, the father of Jupiter. We're talking about Jupiter, who says, oh, go for it. Try it. Think about what you want to do. Whatever you do, I'm behind you. But they don't know how to set limits. So that was very definitely, and that is a thing that's very associated with Sagittarius, is not knowing when to set limits, not knowing when to say enough is enough, to be overindulgent, to overextend oneself. Yeah, and there is a fine line between overextension. We need to look at that. There's risk takers and there's risk takers. A risk taker who makes it will oftentimes have overextended themselves, but they were lucky and they made it happen. But in order to really have balance and judgment, it is in the horoscope. If you look at the horoscope, important to have Saturn, the father of Jupiter or Zeus, somewhere placed so it's pretty strong. And what we oftentimes associate, like in business, if we look at business cycles, good, strong business people will oftentimes have a very strong Jupiter or Sagittarius in the chart, but they'll also have a very good, strong Saturn or Capricorn in the chart, because these two gods are always sparring and warring with each other and trying to bring balance into each other's lives. Now, not to be just talking about male mythologies, there's a very wonderful feminine mythology that's associated with Sagittarius. Sagittarius is very much out of doors kind of personality. We talked about that when we briefly spoke about camping and backpacking. And women as well as men can be out of doors types. And Sagittarius is associated with hunting, and it's associated with tweeds and hunting garb and just walking through the wilderness. And one of the wonderful, beautiful images in mythology that is associated with Sagittarius is the god Artemis. And in some of the mythologies, she was Diana, although I love the name Artemis. I think it just has a real flow about it. And Artemis was a rather independent young woman who could have had any god that she wanted as a consort or husband, but she preferred to stay single. And she would walk always very peacefully and quietly through the sacred grove. The dogs were always right next to her. You always see her in pictures or carvings or sculptures with at least 2 or 3 dogs next to her. And they're always those long, lanky dogs, the ones like Great Danes or Afghans, the big, lanky dogs. That's, Sagittarians like their dogs. They like their animals. You always see them wandering around with at least one dog. And it's part of them. It's part of their myth. And she would walk through the sacred grove with her dogs and like her peace and like her space. And she was also considered to be the moon goddess, too. She was responsible. She didn't have children of her own, which is kind of interesting because lots of times people who have Sagittarius in the charts won't have children of their own, but they'll take care of other people's children, like a school teacher, And she was always facilitating the birth of all these young people and promoting birth, but she didn't have any of her own, and that's the way she wanted it. And she would camp out alone. She was never afraid. I would say, the women's movement is very much a Sagittarius, Artemis kind of feeling. But there's also kind of a ruthless side to Artemis too. I mean, there's positive and negatives with each of these characters. And there's one wonderful story. It's kind of a gruesome story, but it sends home a point where one day she's in her sacred grove of deer. She was very fond of deer. And in fact, there is a fascination with this sign of the zodiac as well as with the sign Cancer, which happens around July, with deer, with animals of the night who have that graceful leaping kind of feeling to them, because antelope and reindeer and deer, they can jump, they can jump fences, and they have that real graceful gazelle kind of look, and that's very Sagittarian. And she was one day in her grove of sacred deer, and she was taking a shower, I guess, washing herself in the sacred fountain. And there was a young man that was very enamored of her, and he was literally in the sacred grove peering through the bushes at her. And she didn't know he was there at first, but then she found out he was there. He had moved past her private place. He had moved into her space. And as soon as she realized that this young man was in the bush, her other side, her treacherous side, her bestial side, I guess, the centaur side of her came out, and she magically changed the young man into a stag. And she set her dogs upon him, and they killed him and they ate him because her private space was being invaded. And so this is part of Sagittarius too. They need, very much like Pisces, because Sagittarius and Pisces are both ruled by Jupiter, they need that space that they can go to that nobody else is allowed into, not even somebody that you're very close to, because it's that space where you find all your life juice, where you create and you incubate and you think, and it's their sacred space. And so in that story, that's one of the stories that occurs. There's a lot of other stories with Artemis that are interesting stories too. One of the other stories is that her brother is the god Apollo, who is the beautiful golden child of Zeus. And so the brother and sister basically have the same, likes and dislikes. They both like the arts. They both like music. And, they both sort of support each other in those areas. They're very fond of each other. And it's a brother-sister kind of myth. So when you see strong Sagittarius in the chart, or people who have a lot of Sagittarius, there may be a very strong brother-sister connection. There's lots of times a real closeness between brothers and sisters. There's a real strong, some families, brothers and sisters don't get along at all. But in this particular group, they get along very well, and they support each other's skills and talents, even though they might be very, very different. And so there's that side too.
Hello, this is Georgia Stathis. You've been listening to our archived series, Myths and Signs of the Zodiac, and we thank you. If you like what you heard and you'd like to know more and hear more, please go to our website at starcycles.com, where you can find an assortment of available tools, pieces of information, and things that you can use in your own practice or in your own study of astrology. Again, thank you so much, and we hope to see you soon.